afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Madeline Gabriel, and I'm the Director of Sustainable Future, which is one of Nesta's 3 missions. We're here to help the UK rapidly reduce its carbon emissions, specifically by focusing on homes, which contribute around 20% of emissions every year. Now, this is the 4th in a series of 5 events, talking to experts about this area. We've talked to people who are working in policy, in finance, new business models, consumer issues. We've talked to engineers who are working on heating. We've even talked to historians and social scientists to see what we can learn from the past. But today, we're going to be focusing on those people who are at the cutting edge, so people who are already deep in the world of decarbonising homes. In this event, you're going to hear from 3 carbon cutting pioneers, and you'll have your opportunity to put your questions to them. So, what experiences can they share? How can we learn from each other to support the UK's road to zero carbon? I'll briefly explain how the event's going to run, and then we'll just crack on. So what we've got is 3 speakers. I'll introduce them in a second. They'll each give a short presentation, and then I'll ask them a question or 2. Once the 3 presentations are done, we'll turn to audience questions. So I'd really encourage you to start thinking about those as you hear the presentations. Please do put them in the chat. We'll get through as many of those as possible. We'll stop as close to possible as possible to 2 p.m, let you go and have your lunch. So let's crack on. I'll introduce the speakers. Really pleased, first of all, to be joined by Emily Brayan from Sprung, UK. Emily has an MSc in area-based retrofit. She's got 16 years of experience in the social housing sector, and she's been working on some of the UK's most innovative retrofit schemes. She is passionate about using collective action to drive energy efficiency in the sector, and she brings hands-on knowledge and creative thinking to help solve our net zero challenges. Welcome, Emily. Secondly, we have Andy Sutton. He's the co-founder of Zero, alongside CEO James. He's also the Chief Innovation Officer, responsible for the full breadth of Zero's activities, ranging from research to digital product development. He's also a chartered architect and past president of the Royal Society of Architects in Wales. Welcome, Andy. It's great to have you. And finally, we've got Charlie Baker, Director of Red Cooperative. Red are design and build retrofit specialists, and they aim to make retrofit aspirational through high quality design and specification. They're also trying to improve standards across the sector. They've co-authored several reports on retrofit standards and finance, and established the Retrofit Pattern Book to help share best practice ideas in retrofit. Welcome, Charlie. Good to have you. Right, Emily, we're going to turn to you first. So I'll let you do your presentation, and then afterwards we'll have a quick chat.
Great, thank you, Madeline. So I'm going to just share my slides. Fantastic. So yeah, Emily Brayan, Sprung UK, and I'm going to talk a bit about lessons from the first Sprung pilots in the UK. But firstly, just a brief introduction to how Sprung came about. And what it actually means. So it means energy leap in Dutch, and the model came from the Netherlands. Around 2014 it started, and in 2015 a group of people from the UK took a coach to the Netherlands to go and have a look at this neighbourhood approach to industrialised retrofit. And we saw these Dutch companies delivering industrialised components, creating homes that looked like new build from old homes, and they were doing it at scale. So the image you see there on the slide is one of the neighbourhoods that they were doing around that time. And that inspired us to set up Sprung UK to try and support a rapid scale up of net zero retrofit in the UK, and to try and solve some of the challenges that we see in the UK at the moment. And my slide says we've got to deliver 2 homes per minute to achieve our 2050 targets. But actually, I think Energy Systems Catapult have just done some research that says that's more like 8 homes. And every time we check in on this number, the situation gets worse. We really need to rapidly scale up retrofit. That's 8 homes per minute now. That's a huge undertaking. And not only are we not doing this fast enough at the moment, but we're not doing it to the right standards. So when we go in and do retrofit, frequently we do single measures and they don't get us close enough to our net zero targets. And although there are discussions at the moment about heat pumps being suitable for the majority of properties, if we were to just change all homes to heat pumps and assume that the grid would decarbonise sufficiently, we'd have challenges with fuel poverty, with costs going up, we'd have inefficient heat pumps, we'd have pressure on the grid at peak times. So the Energy Sprung vision here is that we have at least a large segment of UK homes that achieve net zero targets, and they do that through an industrialised retrofit approach. We have boom and bust grant funding, and we're heavily reliant on grant to fund our retrofit mission at the moment. And we need to move away from that. We need to reduce that reliance and use smaller amounts of grant to get to where we need to get to. So the Energy Sprung model has a business case that sits behind it, where the energy and maintenance savings over a 30-year period are capitalised to fund the cost of the project. And we have a craft-based construction industry, which is not diverse, and it's ageing workforce, it's not appealing. And that isn't going to scale rapidly enough to be able to deliver these 8 homes per minute, particularly if we have to go back in and that number becomes higher because we're not doing everything in one go. And finally, we've got slow work on site, disruptive work for occupiers, which makes it unappealing. People don't want to buy a retrofit in the same way they want to buy a kitchen at the moment. And we need to change that. We need to make these more of an aspirational thing that people want to buy into. So Energy Sprung, as I've said, it's got a business model that sits behind it. It's got a guaranteed performance, which makes that business case viable. So the solution provider, which is a new role, which addresses the fragmentation that we see often in the retrofit market, they're responsible for the design, the delivery, and then a performance warranty for a long period, which enables those savings in energy and maintenance to be used and to be borrowed against by a housing provider, which is where we're launching this in the UK at the moment. And it's about doing the whole thing in one go. So a housing provider will have a budget in to repair or to replace their roof and their windows, but it's about saying if you spend that money now in a different way and leap your home forward to 2050 standards and provide a warm and comfortable home for your occupiers now, actually that money will go further. And there's a focus on people as well. So the guarantee is not just about the maintenance cost, but it's also about the comfort and the energy bills for the residents. And if you think of this a bit like a mobile phone bundle, so the residents are able to use as much energy as they want. They can spend more money, they can use more energy, but actually there's a guaranteed performance which enables everybody to live in a home comfortably for a maximum price. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the UK pilots and some lessons from these, with a view to how those lessons sort of come to pass if we're going to actually scale retrofit. So these are lessons around how to scale net zero retrofit. We've structured it a bit as the good, the bad and the ugly. The big image there is from Nottingham. So that was the first UK Energy Sprung pilot. And I was heavily involved in that because I was head of energy at Nottingham City Homes at the time. So the lessons I will share are from that project, but the other 2 images are from the second project, which just shows the different type of solutions that can be retrofitted. This isn't a one size fits all. And these are the Nottingham properties before the retrofit. And my first lesson, which is a good lesson, I think we did well with this, is to pick the right archetypes. So as I touched on earlier, I think if we were to think about how do we get our whole portfolio across the UK, our whole housing stock to net zero, there are some properties that will not get there. There are properties in conservation zones which absolutely require that more craft-based traditional approach to retrofitting, more bespoke solutions. But there's also a huge segment of properties that could have an industrialised retrofit sector launched on that basis. And we think these are the types of property. So as you can see on the right-hand side, those houses are bungalows. And some of the residents who lived in there, one of the biggest impacts for them, it wasn't the energy, it was the aesthetic improvements. One of the residents said, my house used to look like a rabbit hutch. And now it's absolutely fantastic. And then we had the first supply chain event when we were starting to launch the tender. People thought these were sheds. They didn't realise that these were homes that people were living in. So if you pick the right archetypes, there's a huge value on top of the energy of the regeneration that can be achieved through doing this kind of whole building retrofit to 2050 standards. Historic maintenance, and I think a lot of organisations delivering under the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund are finding this now. that you pick the properties that have big budgets available for maintenance, you pick the properties that are the worst performing, and often those properties have been identified as being in a programme for retrofit. So things will not have happened over the last 5 or 10 years that should have done. And we've found properties that have holes in roofs and buckets collecting water. We've found properties where floors are rotten because the path on the side of the building has been laid to fall in the wrong direction, or it breaches the damp proof course. And not only are there cost implications of those types of repairs needing to be carried out, but there's also a programme impact. So we need to build into our retrofit planning sufficient time to actually identify these issues and then to rectify them before the energy efficiency work starts. And then the last one, the ugly, was a bit of an error really in this one. And I think it's just important to recognise that sometimes these things go wrong. So this was an asbestos issue, and due to lack of consistency within different contract documents, this fell between the client and the solution provider. And what occurred in the end was somebody drilling through asbestos, which caused a big delay, and it caused some challenges with residents who are living in properties. And I think with industrialised retrofit, a delay is more of a challenge because you've got a road closure booked, you've got a manufacturing slot booked. And when you find something that occurs just before you're due to start on site with some of those more intensive pieces of work, a delay can have a huge knock-on impact on costs and sort of require you to put things much further back. This is the drawing. So these are panels being craned on, and you can see there's a difference. The big one is a second phase. So there's about 5 phases of this particular project in Nottingham. You can see on the bottom right, the panel going on has no windows, but on the big image, it has got windows in. And each of these phases shows continuous improvement, which I'll come back to in a second. So the good lessons, the good learning on this one, tenant focus. So we engaged, there were only 10 homes. We managed to engage the tenants very intensively at the start of the project. And we asked them what was good about living in their home and what was bad about living in their home, what they'd change. And their feedback informed the tender process. So they were able to say things like, actually, most of our living is on a floor which is not the ground floor. So if people want to come and knock on our door, we can't hear them. So a doorbell would be really helpful, and a downstairs outdoor tap to water plants. And they're things that you wouldn't know about, and they're relatively small cost, but actually they made a big difference to the residents living there. And by doing that, the residents were really engaged with the project and really felt ownership. So when there are inevitable delays in innovation projects, it was much easier to manage that relationship. So I said I'd come back to the continuous improvement, and we set out, having gone to the Netherlands and seeing this inspirational approach where people were buying retrofit whole house products. We came back thinking we could buy the same thing. So our tender exercise was structured around being able to procure these solutions. In reality, these solutions didn't exist in the UK. And what we should have been procuring was a partner to develop the solutions. And it's a slightly different approach. It starts the relationship and the contract in a different way. And it gives people a better understanding of the risk and how to manage that across the different parties. The Energy Sprung UK Innovation Partnership is reflecting that learning. So we're setting up an innovation partnership under the GLA, which is in operation now. And it's an innovative procurement that allows the housing provider and the solution provider to work together through a process of design, prototyping, piloting, and then scaling up. And subject to successful scale up, they then get onto a £10 billion framework where anybody can buy a retrofit product that's been tried and tested. So that will exist in the future, but at the moment, there is now a better recognition of how these risks are being shared and managed, and the sort of collaborative approach to working out some of these challenges. And that feeds into the next point, which is around having contingency for innovation. And we didn't have sufficient contingency on this project. And at the moment, the grant funding that we have in the UK is structured in such a way that we have to innovate whilst projects are live and we've got tenants in properties. And that's challenging. It's challenging from a timeframe perspective. And it's also challenging in terms of actually getting the innovation trialed and tested and then implementing something you know is going to work. So in this project, the first energy centre that was installed didn't work well enough. And whilst that was a solution provider Risk, in reality, the solution provider was an SME, and therefore that risk actually fell to the client. So it was really important for the client to have been a bit more aware of that to begin with. Final slide on lessons, and then I'll draw to a close. So this is an image of what it looked like afterwards. So huge impact on the area. So aesthetics was a big win for this project. Commissioning and behaviour change. So there were some performance challenges initially with this project, and partly that was down to a very long commissioning process because of the level of innovation with the energy centre that was included, which took all the homes off grid and had just one grid connection. So some really complex equipment there. And then also behaviour change impacted on this, on the early performance challenges. And there are still some ongoing challenges with behaviour change where some of the residents are struggling to get on board with temperatures not being as hot on their radiators. And I think technical solutions are needed so that when radiators aren't hot to the touch, people can still understand that their home is warm. They need something visual or something that they can touch to see that things are still warm, or to feel that things are still warm. And ongoing management and maintenance. I've got this as the sort of last one, the ugly one, because this is really a big structural change that's required. So we are doing these projects for net zero homes. But after the project, somebody has to manage these and they have to maintain them. And we don't yet have the kind of infrastructure that's required to do that. So if you look at a car, the automotive industry, you've obviously got lots of garages set up that are accredited with manufacturers to be able to provide servicing that maintains a warranty. That doesn't yet happen in housing, and that requires a big structural change, and it requires scale, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg. It won't come until the scale. So that's one of the things we need to collectively tackle. I had one final slide, which I will touch on, but really it's about asks that we've identified for government, which are policy changes that are needed to unlock net zero retrofit at scale. So this is about carving out net zero targets for those properties that can achieve it, around investing in innovation so that innovative products can be fed into live projects. Zero carbon should mean zero VAT, secure business models such as the Energy Sprung one, and then also much lower borrowing rates for this type of infrastructure project. And that's it for me, and hopefully we can discuss more in the questions. Thank you.
It's fantastic, Emily. Thanks so much. I think there's loads of things that I'd quite like to pick up about that, and I think there's already some useful comments in the chat. So what I'm going to do is go to the other presentations first, and then we'll come back and discuss as a group so that we've got time to pick up everyone's questions. Thank you. Andy, can I pass over to you to do your presentation?
Of course. Thanks, everyone, and thanks. Fascinating to watch the previous one. So if I click on these correctly, there we are. So hi, I'm Andy. I'm an architect by training. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Cero and one of the two co-founders. So quite a lot to rattle through, as will be the case with all the speakers today, I'm sure. I'll start by explaining who we are. Cero was founded in 2017 with a mission to deliver net zero carbon across both new and existing homes. We're a certified B Corp, so we're trying to deliver net zero carbon in the right way with all the appropriate ethics, and of course part of that is a living wage employer, and there's around about 50 in the team now. We're expecting that to double, or a little more than double, during the course of 2022. Part of that doubling is as a result of investment from Legal & General and from Hodge Bank, who are a Welsh-based charitably owned bank that's helping us expand and therefore fuel more growth for support for more homes to get more people on the journey to net zero. We've also, as you can see from the bottom of the slides there, been fortunate enough to win and be selected for a few accelerators and launch pads and prizes and all that kind of stuff, which is brilliant. Before I talk about what we're doing, I'll spare two slides to say that we get a bit fussy about net zero carbon. And the reason we get fussy about that is because there's a lot of different types of approaches to get to net zero. And many of them look at net zero energy, and some of them look at net zero energy for just regulated emissions, so heating, or sometimes heating and hot water. When we talk about net zero carbon, we talk about it measured in carbon, and we talk about the entire impact of the home, including what would be loosely called plug-in appliances. So the people that plug things in and operate their home need to be counted as part of that impact for that home. So to use a catchphrase, homes with humans. And the reason that's really important is expressed by two graphs. One of them is the graph on the left at the moment, and that's showing the decarbonisation of the energy grid. The National Grid has been doing some great work decarbonising in the past decade or 15 years or so, and it continues, and we should be working in harmony with the grid to deliver that. The second of the graphs shows the variability of electrical carbon impacts. So this is primarily true of electricity, but true of all energy forms to some degree. And this is 24 hours expressed as carbon impacts for the same energy for 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. So what that shows, or what that endeavours to show, is when the energy is drawn from the grid, or indeed when the energy is pushed to the grid, if you've got renewables on site, makes an incredible difference to the carbon impact that that energy has. So all the things we'll talk about in the following slides are based on the underlying calculation engines that we've been developing and building and continue to refine that actually assess the impact of when the energy is drawn to or from the grid and the carbon equivalent of that. So we've got a carbon engine that's trying to figure out whether we're getting to net zero carbon rather than using energy as a proxy, because as that graph shows, it doesn't really have a one-to-one relationship. So it's mostly a talk about retrofit, but you can't really talk about retrofit without covering off the easy bit at the start, because every home we build becomes at the moment a retrofit problem. We're building, well, allegedly across the UK, we build around about 200,000 homes a year, and UK government has been promoting to try and get that to 300,000. As it stands, every single one of those will need retrofit to get to net zero carbon. That's an absurd situation, and we've been working with partners to try and get homes to be delivered to a net zero carbon standard. Now, how we do that is by looking at grid decarbonisation and where that is going, and working out what a sensible, pragmatic specification for the home is that will get to net zero carbon in harmony with the grid in the future. So the homes we partner with, and as it says on the slide, we've got about 500 on site at the moment, aren't net zero carbon the day they're built, but without any retrofit, they will become net zero carbon at some point in the 2030s, because they effectively ride the last bit of the journey by working in harmony with the grid. So those are on site at the moment. That's a slightly old photograph now. Most of those are built out, but that site continues to build, and we've got other sites working with partners across all tenure types. So private developers, social landlords, councils, we're working with all of them on new build. We've published freely what we think a net zero carbon specification is, and you can get that from our website, and that's available in relatively plain language, at least for the construction industry, to understand what we'd expect to see in a home that's going to genuinely deliver net zero carbon beyond necessarily net zero energy, and including, of course, humans in those homes. So the real focus for today is to explain what we're doing around retrofit. And we're working primarily in Wales at the moment, although we are expanding out across the rest of the UK at the end of last year, and a big exercise for us during this year. We've got around about 3,000 homes having some degree of retrofit measures installed at the moment, split between just over, I think now, 30 social landlords, again, primarily in Wales, but increasingly across into England and beyond. All of those are looking at a planned intervention approach, which I'll talk about at the end with how we support all of these things. With Pobble, Wales's largest social landlord, we're retrofitting 650 homes, where we're looking at a mechanism to recover some of the costs, to support the residents getting an energy bill saving, especially important at the moment with the chaos happening in the energy markets, but also generate some return to pay for those retrofit measures to support that happening as a net capital through a special purpose vehicle to pay the capital back. And then lastly, we're working with about half a dozen at the moment financial institutions, but that number's creeping up, to work how to engage with residents who've got mortgages on their homes, homeowner occupiers, and support them to start going on their journey for their homes to get to net zero carbon. A big part of the project we're doing in Retrofit is a program that we've put together of that collaboration called Optimized Retrofit. This has a large proportion of those several thousand homes included within it. It's funded by Welsh Government, who've grant funded social landlords to start tackling retrofitting their homes. There's 250,000 social homes within Wales, and Welsh Government has set a fairly ambitious target of EPC A, which not particularly a metric we're fans of, but that's the one that's set at the moment, and to get to there by the very early 2030s. So it's a tall target in a short time frame, really. To do that with the optimized retrofit collaboration, we're working beyond just what the right measures are in the homes to get them right for the residents and right for the building fabric to get to that net zero carbon performance. We're engaging across the spectrum as to how we can support skills, training, foundational economy. We've, with partners on the project, we've built a dynamic procurement framework or dynamic procurement system that supports decarbonisation works. We're investigating in quite some detail the cost and indeed how those costs will change going forward. And you may well be pleased to hear that we think the costs are a lot less than perhaps some in Westminster currently still think they are. We're mapping out retrofit demand and opportunities, and we're also working very hard on resident engagement and tenant engagement as a subset of that to understand how to get in through the front door and understand and support the outcomes for the people that live in the homes. Much as Emily was saying, winning the hearts and minds of the people in the homes is the absolute first step to getting decarbonisation to work. And lastly, and not least, I'll touch on this in the last slides, all of those homes, whether they're new build or retrofit, generally speaking, are bringing information back on a very granular level about occupancy and performance once those retrofit measures have been installed. So this is how we support all of those projects. We've got a series of what would normally be 5 steps. Which hangs around a building passport and then ultimately the opportunity of comfort services for the residents at the end. So walking through those in the few minutes I've got remaining, we start by needing to understand the existing home, whether that's a new build home and we're importing BIM diagrams of the building, or more likely understanding an existing property and getting a good quality survey to understand its retrofit readiness. So we've got a tablet-based survey tool, although that's not the only way of getting information into the building passport that we host. And that is PAS 2035 aligned. Of course, you can't be compliant with PAS 2035 at the minute because the mechanisms aren't there, but written by some of the authors of PAS 2035, that capture survey allows us to form a very comprehensive understanding of the existing condition of the home. Now that survey imports into the next step on the journey, which is the pathway to zero, hosted within our Passport Online. The pathway allows the competent user to be able to plan a series of intervention on the home to see the feedback in technical terms. What's the impact on the residents' energy bills? What's the impact on the energy usage? What's the impact on potentially costs of capital costs, operational costs? What's the impact of carbon? All of those metrics, which can be calculated by cloud compute these days, mapped out and presented back for each step. The next step on this journey, which I'm conscious of time, I'll rattle through, is wherever we can, we suggest that a building energy engine, that's the only piece of hardware we talk about, goes into the home. That then monitors the energy strategy, the energy submetering within the home, as well as internal environment. And that's providing data back into the building passport, giving residents a better understanding of how their home runs, where they spend their hard-earned cash on their fuel bill, but also where it's landlords understanding how to improve that property going forward. The penultimate one there is the Verify app. We'll be launching that in the second half of this year. This is a means of us supporting the industry to demonstrate quality of install and to update the building passport to ensure that when measures have been installed, they've been installed correctly, and that the passport captures that measure in place and records it, and then can start to record where those measures are actually delivering what they should be, or where they're perhaps not delivering against what the model suggested, and we can begin to understand where those differences are. And last and by no means least, should the resident choose, then the operation of that home can be switched over to optimize on the resident's behalf. For the new build homes we run, that reduces their energy bill by about 40%, but it gives them a comfort outcome along the way. So that's the mechanism to ensure that that home can be run as zero carbon once it's capable of getting there through its retrofit and new build journey. So that's me in a very big nutshell, but yes, that's what we're doing at Cero, and very happy to help support anyone that wants to collaborate to deliver net zero carbon in homes. That's what we do.
Thanks so much, Andy. Again, there's some questions that I think are applicable to all panelists, so I'll save some of them to the end, but there's just one that's more of a point of clarification from Tom Broughton, and he asks, what's in it for landlords? How did they get a return when they work with Cero?
There are a number of different ways one can do this, but the primary way for landlords, depending whether they're social or private, of course, social landlords have obligations being put upon them by relevant devolved or Westminster governments. What we can do is provide a seamless journey through that mechanism to get to net zero carbon for the home. So we can tell you what net zero carbon looks like. We can support mostly your own team. We tend to follow the teach someone to fish rather than give someone a fish approach, and then the tools will allow those people to plan out the journey for each of the homes across a whole stock, record that as an entire portfolio for the landlord, monitor the progress against it, but also where we've got a couple of mechanisms to get some financial return to help cover the capital costs. And I think that's one of the key ones which people are struggling with. Net zero at its heart is a problem of capital outlay versus operational savings, and you have to be able to close that circle to make it work.
Thanks so much. We'll come back to speak more at the end, but now I just wanted to pass over to Charlie for the final presentation. Charlie, take it away. You're on mute, Charlie.
Got in there. I wanted to make sure we actually said you're on mute. It's the 2022. We're a very small, I feel a bit of an imposter syndrome here, very tiny business that's just been trying to find the gaps in retrofit, why it isn't happening, what the problems are, and then trying to look for solutions. And I mean, the crucial thing about retrofit is the greenest building is one that already exists. That graph there from Simon Sturgis says that basically all the bit we're trying to make zero is but naught compared to the carbon emissions involved in building the property in the first place. Anything up to 80 tons for a new house, and that's the average, but between 50 and 80 tons, Simon Sturgis said. So an awful lot of carbon just going there. So if we can save these things, and this does look like a bit of a basket case, but actually we polished it up quite nicely. And the nice thing about that is it gives us that chance to also help stabilize communities, because the problem with demolition and rebuild is it doesn't half play merry hell with how communities feel like they're getting on. We've also done it with non-residential as well. And this one was formerly 3 Weavers' cottages knocked through to make Manchester Digital Laboratory up in the super hit northern quarter of Manchester, which we then polished up into being an event space downstairs and then offices upstairs, knocked 60% off their carbon emissions, despite only actually not doing the front and sorting out the lighting and all their other bits. But the other point about retrofit is it gives you so many other opportunities as well. As Madeline said, we want to try and make retrofit something people actively want, not just because it makes them healthy and reduces carbon and reduces their cost of occupation and that kind of thing. It's also because you can make things so much nicer if you're going to have a play. So we had a bit of a fun with a steel staircase, very lightweight to keep the embodied emissions down, made by a local fabricator, and LED lighting throughout, obviously. Another thing we can do with retrofit is we can also do the other things. So this actually, somebody mentioned a bit about conservation areas. This is on the edge of one, but not quite in it. So the house underneath actually should have been in the conservation area, quite a sweetie. They wanted a loft conversion. We wanted to keep it as minimal as possible and not compete with the rest of the house. So we'd already done the retrofit downstairs, working with other organisations, to get that to somewhere near a zero carbon target, but that's before we knew it had to be zero. That was an 80% reduction. And then we built this loft conversion on the top, plywood, zinc, as many low carbon materials as we could, and we insulated it to the point where they still haven't put a radiator up there. And then you've got to and then there's also the materials you use. Obviously, timber is the one that everyone really likes. But where do we get it from? Can we strengthen the viability of our local of our own carbon sinks? Obviously, Wales way ahead of the rest of the country on this, and I'm a little bit jealous. This is English oak from the borders, in fact, to make the kitchen on the right. On the left is a kind of mini cross-laminated timber from Austria. I'm really hoping somebody will make that here. So we can let's bring a bit of excitement into retrofit while we're there. But then the next thing, the third thing is really useful jobs. Not sitting in a call center wondering what you were born for, but actually I'm doing something to make people's lives better. I've had several people through Red, and sometimes it says, what is the bit you get the most out of it? And a lot of them have said, the look on people's faces when their houses are warm and comfortable and look so much nicer. We've been trying to get some more women involved on the tools as well. Sadly, this last that's doing this insulation for me is so much better at the other things she does. I've not been able to steer her into retrofit, but it's a good picture because we've got a chronic problem with jobs. 750,000 new construction jobs across the country. So I've estimated about 35,000 just in Greater Manchester. And it's not just tradespeople, it's the people to manage the tradespeople and the renewable installers for the shiny things. And one day we'll win the argument about the occasional designer in it as well. And the Construction Leadership Council fortunately agrees. They put it down into a much more granular level. As you'll see, if you look down that graph on the right-hand side, a lot of them aren't retrofit specific jobs. They are tradespeople. Because we've got this big problem. A lot of people are, dare I say it, in the trade my age, and they're wanting a little sit down at some point soon. And we're not bringing people back in to replace them. We've obviously also been caught out by having ended our informal contract with the Eastern European construction training providers, and a lot of our EU workforce has gone home. Let's be honest, and that's exposed a chronic problem with what we've got available to us. But Retrofit gives us this opportunity to create Construction 2.0. It's because we don't even have enough construction workers for the industry that we've got. We've got that opportunity to create some new ones. And so we can build customer trust with a new bunch of people. We can build competencies from the ground level upwards. We can get rid of some of the sort of the more traditional stereotypical scaffolding behavior, and we can make it a place where lots of other people you don't often see on building sites want to work. And then but I think we can also make a lot of the skills that you need for this aspirational. I've found that the need for decent high-grade woodworkers is much higher than you'd expect in a retrofit, because you've got to rehang doors properly. You've got to put window reveals back in. You've got to fit windows that actually are vertical so they don't swing open. And there is this opportunity, because of the direct connection with the customer, to actually make them give a true pride and satisfaction in your job. So we set up this thing called the Retrofit Get In project, where we actually no, we don't need to see me. There's a video on there. If you Google Retrofit Get In, then you'll get a little of me wandering around this house. The point with it was, though, that we got a whole load of out of work theatre workers mid-pandemic, desperate for work because they're already part of the gig economy, and managed to get them some work. We found it really interesting that actually they got on with it, and I had to redesign some of the retrofit measures to make it easy. But on that scaffolding there, you've got 2 event workers and a former set builder from the Lowry, that guy buried up to with only his feet visible was the automation manager for the Royal Exchange Theatre, dab hand with a power tool. Unfortunately gone back to work, didn't manage to keep him, and really unfortunately we didn't manage to get the training community to recognize the value of what we were doing and be able to enable us to train these people. They kept saying, well, we've got apprenticeships, and we're saying, well, who am I apprenticing them to? The good news is, though, that what we found in terms of getting people into this industry is that actually the red bit at the bottom, the bit about retrofit itself, the knowledge, is not as important as all the other, actually arguably life skills. And so I think we can take people from a wide variety of walks of life and get them into retrofit. We've started the ball rolling on this by taking our retrofit measures and redesigning them around different day rates. So anyone from London, just don't look at those day rates. I understand how hopelessly ridiculous they look to you, but they work up north because it's grim up north. We basically said you've got your unskilled, but we've got a bit of work for them. In the case of internal wall insulation, only 7%, but on underfloor insulation that climbs quite high. So on average across several measures, we ended up with 15% of the workforce could come in with no previous experience at all. We're going to need 15% that are fully skilled. They can do it by themselves without me having to keep an eye. And then we've got a staircase between the two. And my view is that what we actually need to be able to do is get training to work so we can put them on sites. We've got a string of customers who are willing to let me put trainees on their job as long as they don't have to pay for their training, which seems fair enough, really. But have I been able to get the public sector to pony up for that? No, I haven't. Other options, though, we can get better at it. I love the idea of being an innovation manager. I'd love to be one of those, chief innovation director or something. Thanks, Andy. You've inspired me there to go and ask for a job. So we've looked at external wall insulation. This is a new system we've developed with Back to Earth down in Devon, looking at ways to make the render easier, looking at ways to use the timber, and that gate's made from locally sourced, UK sourced English larch. And there's the house before and after. I'm inordinately proud of that bay window. We cut out the top light to get more light in, and we've been doing some stuff around off-site construction as well. That guy on the left, he's a film editor, but we've been trying that out because obviously when you're doing a dormer window, you've got a big hole in the roof. Can you get it up very fast? Floors, that's a key grip on the left, an artist, and 2 people that build work for artists. And then we built the floor off site, brought it to site. So a bit energy sprung-ish, but actually mainly because we wanted to take a ceiling down and replace it. On the bay window, because that needed to be done in the same day for security, the same thing, we use their CNC to do it. I learnt my way around doing steam bending some larch. So old trades are in there as well, because people want you to make like you weren't there. And so on this one, we even learned our way how to do curved internal wall insulation, and my plasterer as a dab hand at rebuilding the cornices. But there's a lot to do. It's across multiple different areas. We need to be taking small pieces and getting them to work across lots of different areas, so that we build the sort of the seeds of what we want done, so that we can make it work. So that what we do is, if we team up Whole House Retrofit with renewable energy and storage, then the calculations that I did suggest we can actually get to zero carbon by 2038. Fuel poverty can go by 2030 if we do some of it cleverly, and no net cost to the public purse except training. And this is the bit that I think we really have some work to do. So just those are my final slide, really. It's just some things that we desperately need to think about. If we're going to build a workforce of 750,000 people, we've got to start young. We've got to value the jobs, not treat tradespeople as idiots. We've got to make sure our colleges are not doing tick box training, but the proper thing, so you can send someone to site with something you can start them to work with. And we also need to recognise that construction ought not to just be a career of last resort. We've got to make it aspirational, so that we've got that wider range of applicants. Thank you.
Now I'm on mute. Thanks so much, Charlie. That was fantastic. Can I bring back all the panelists, because we've got lots of questions to address, and I'd like everyone to have a go at them. Thank you. There's a couple of things that have come through from the audience that I'd like to pick up first, and then I've got a few questions for you too. So during Emily and Andy's presentations in particular, there were several questions from various people asking about the applicability of the approaches that you're developing for the private sector. So I think both of you talked mainly about working with social landlords. So Emily, to go to you first, and then I'll ask the others to comment. Can that industrialised approach you talked about be translated to the private sector, and how might we do that?
I think it can, and I think somebody in the chat suggested a kind of community area-based scheme, and I think that is the way. We've started with the social housing sector because they have large quantities of homogenous stock. They also have maintenance budgets. So I think often with private owners, they don't really kind of have a plan for maintaining their home, whereas social housing providers, they do need to have that. And the energy sprung model is based on them spending the money they would have spent to maintain it as usual to get to net zero instead. So I think there are methods of borrowing against the home under green mortgages that are starting to come out under the Green Finance Institute, for example. So there's some interesting movements around how those types of deep retrofit might be funded. But I think, as somebody else has pointed out, it's that how do you actually get this to work? Because you do need volume and you do need scale to get that industrialized approach to work. And for that, you need to have similar properties. You need to be doing repetitive work. So having lots of kind of individual bespoke one-off projects is probably more suited at this stage to something that's a bit more craft-based or traditional. Although I really liked Charlie's example of being able to use off-site manufacture for things like dormer windows, because I think component-wise, definitely there are opportunities. Some of the things like the energy modules that we're seeing used in energy sprung projects could be applied to private sector homes so that they're not taking up valuable space inside the property. And by doing that, you create a big market for some of those components that then starts to reduce their cost, which helps the overall challenge be achieved.
That's great. Thanks. And Andy, I think you actually said you work with all sectors. Like, how does your approach vary between working with, say, social landlords and the private sector?
Yeah, It kind of doesn't vary, but it does vary, I suppose. That's a terrible answer, isn't it? So ultimately, where I think a number of organisations are looking, and certainly we're one of them, is that every home in the UK will need to have a digital presence, and call that a logbook or a passport or whatever. And that's one of the things we do. And these things need to be interactable so that you can review the data that's in the building passport, whether you have 1,000 homes in a portfolio or whether you're a homeowner occupier and you're just looking at your own home. Now that needs to embed within it a medium-term retrofit plan, as Trustmark would call it, to represent the journey of that home from wherever it starts to getting to net zero carbon. The approach that homeowner chooses to take, whether they're a portfolio homeowner or an individual occupier, may well vary because there's more than one way to get to net zero. And that's what we always try to look for in terms of how that's best supported along the journey. For us at the moment, of the 17 million or so homes which are in owner-occupier status in the UK, about half of those have mortgages secured on them, just over. And what we're doing at the moment is working with mortgage providers to provide the support so they have a trusted lending, low-rate, secured source to borrow against. We can evidence savings through the tools that we run on the unique home rather than a normalised pan-UK average saving, which other tools might produce. And that gives the financial body the confidence to say this can actually be a benefit to the resident and still a repayable mortgage. So it does help to square off that problem of, as I said at the end of the talk, net zero carbon is a capital cost but an operational saving, and you've got to be able to put those two to line up to make this all stack up, because there isn't enough grant in the world to pay for net zero by grant. So
that's brilliant, thanks. And Charlie, just to pick up on some of those points as well, I guess it would be good to hear more about the type of clients you work with. You've talked about some individual homes and some industrial or sort of commercial properties like MadLab. And also, picking up on Emily's point, do you see a potential to combine the kind of craft and bespoke approach with also some more industrialised or kind of standardised components?
Well, obviously, I put the stuff about the off-site construction in there because I definitely do see a future for it. I think just to lob a gauntlet out to the digital survey industry, they really need to get their act together so we can get millimetre perfect rather than 5 to 10 millimetre perfect scans of properties that are then legible, because billion point clouds are a challenge. But we used a variety of bits of kit to do that. I think the problem was the design time and the survey time need to be reduced to be able to make it viable. But the bit that was viable is that my mate in that who was steering the crane on that shot, he's got a CNC router in his workshop, because that's what they build artists work with. Occasionally I can slide a slot of work in there while he's building bits and pieces for them. And I think there's quite a lot of people with that kind of machinery. I think once you get to the large offsite panelized construction, that we're not quite there yet, and there's not enough providers of those. So this was all done just CNC on a standard 8x4 cutter. And the nice thing about it is you're working somewhere next to a kettle with a decent cup with some decent coffee. You're not weather dependent. That's been one of the things, obviously, whilst it's a bit of a stereotype that it rains all the time in Manchester, it does rain and I am the rain god, my business partner reckons, because every time I'm going to go on site, put some insulation on the wall, it tips it down, or just when they come into render, the temperature drops below 5 degrees. So there's an awful lot to be said for that bit. In terms of customers, because the space for social landlords is so crowded with consultants, as I'm sure Emily has noticed, I've been ploughing the private home field, because the nice thing about private homeowners is that they are not regulated by what they're allowed to do. And they are, some of them, desperate for agency over climate change. So this house we've been working on, the client is basically an absolute saint, because she wants Retrofit to prove the point. So she's let us have a go at things. I've promised to put it right if it goes wrong. And we have that ability then to be able to test stuff out that a social landlord would go, well, how many of those have you done before then, Sonny? And I'd have to go, maybe not so many. Now I've done a few, obviously. I can nearly hold my own in between Emily and Andy, although I do still feel a bit imposterish. But I think there is an enormous market out there for those early adopters. There's just been some study work done in Greater Manchester that suggests 3% of Greater Manchester's population, so that's over 30,000 households, are up for a deep retrofit, and now.
That's great. This kind of follows on a little bit from that, but there's another question. This is from Chiara Ricky Harper. And she's talking about the idea of needing to be able to take a piecemeal approach or do things bit by bit, because it's quite difficult to borrow money for a deep retrofit on job security. It's kind of not there for many people. But I wanted to put that to all of you, because I think, Andy, you talked about the building passport approach, which kind of implies people can upgrade things over time. Emily, the Sprung, if I've got it right, is a bit more kind of all in one, do everything and don't kind of rely on having to come back. And Charlie, you're kind of somewhere in the middle. What are the pros and cons of going in and doing everything versus having a journey to kind of improving properties over time? Charlie, you put your hand up, so you go first.
Well, because we've done an awful lot of underfloor insulation, for example, because we're the only people with a scrawny enough workforce prepared to go under floors and do it. Where you get your average builder in his high-vis staring down at his beer gut going, "No, mate, I'm not going in there." And so we've done a lot of the piecemeal. I think we're putting a tender together with Retrofit Works for Greater Manchester at the moment to be able to roll something out. And GMCA have got it. They are asking for whole house plans. So the answer to the piecemeal approach is don't do anything to your house if it's going to be abortive work, or if you're going to have to come back and do it again properly later. But yes, of course, you're only going to be able to do some bits one at a time. So in the house that I showed you the curved IWI on, we've developed, it costs us a fortune, frankly, but we've tried it out now and I'll do better next time. When you do the window reveals for your IWI, do them in such a way that when they come to replace the windows later because you couldn't afford it, you can pop out the window reveal rather than trash your entire internal wall insulation. And then that does enable you to save your shekels up and do it bit by bit. I'm quite keen, and we're working with Flexitricity to see if we can build something on this where we can actually aggregate some energy storage income to be able to create a kind of personal retrofit savings fund for people so that they can gradually build up a body of cash to be able to do a retrofit with. Because Andy's point is absolutely right. You've got your straightforward balance of operational savings versus cost recovery. But the bit in the middle is if you've got quite a lot of kilowatts of PV on your roof and a nice big fat 10 kilowatt hour battery that's controlled remotely, there are incomes soon to be derived from that, although the speed of movement is quite slow. I first moved to the idea back in 2013 and we're still not quite there for domestic owners except for local flexibility, but there's money there.
Andy, what would you say on that?
I agree with all of that. I think there is not. We often in these sorts of conversations try and chase after the one silver bullet that's the way to do it, and the reality is there will be any number of ways that we tackle the 27 million or so homes there are in the UK. Some of them, and where we can get communities engaged, are absolutely ripe for a deep retrofit, one hit, let's get it all done and do it. It's almost certainly the most cost-effective way, but it requires the most disruption and it requires the highest cost up front, and then those savings come through. So there's absolutely room for that. There's also room at the other end of the spectrum where people, DIYers and such like, will buy a doer-upper from the early 1900s or whatever, and they'll over the years they'll chip away at it, probably literally, to try and make improvements step by step by step, and over 20 years or hopefully less they'll get to where they need to get to. The point I think that everyone, whether it's Letty or Trustmark or even government now in various devolved states and centrally, recognizes that however you tackle it, whether in one big leap or a series of small shuffles, you need to have in place a plan so that you do the works in a logical sequence and that you try and ensure that you're not doing abortive works or you're minimizing them. And that's really, for us, that's the heart of it. Once you've got a plan in place and what we would call a pathway to zero, then that gives you the mechanism to know that you're doing the right works in the right sequence. The key for us is to be able to make that transition through tenure and through ownership. So if you're a homeowner occupier, you might only take the first 2 steps on your pathway to zero. You may then sell your home. And we're just closing up a project with Rightmove and the RICS that's actually demonstrating that home will have increased its value because of the works you've done. So there's really promising things in the homeowner occupier space around the value that we've been working on as well. But then the next person picks up the pathway to zero and says, right, there's another 3 steps. I may or may not do them. I may reshuffle them, but they've got control and they've got the next step building on the shoulders of those that went before. So I think however you tackle it, it is having a good, coherent, well thought through plan. And we would say that actually takes into account the benefits Charlie mentioned around looking to work in harmony with the grid, looking at those incomes that can come from things like DSR to make sure that this is done whole grid, whole home solution.
Yeah. Emily, what would you like to add on that topic?
Yes, I think I've got a sort of practical example from a project called Destination Zero that Energy Sprung UK is working with Nottingham on. And I guess this is the Energy Sprung. Some of the value we see is being able to request a performance guarantee, and it's quite hard to request a performance guarantee when you're only doing a bit of a property. But there are sometimes challenges when you've just replaced a boiler, for example, and you don't want to take that out before the end of its life. So the Destination Zero project came about from that recognition that there will be some properties that aren't ready to have the whole house done at the same time, but yet you've got issues like the solid wall is really leaking and needs repairing. So you might as well do that element at that point. One of the practical examples of where there are challenges in approaching things in a more incremental way is with the roof on the pilot property in that project. The roof had already been replaced, and Nottingham had to come back to extend the roof and to do some additional detailing around the eaves to try and fit the external wall insulation on. And when they did that, because they had to extend it so much, they ended up having to replace the roof, and it had only been done 8 years before. So I think the point that both Andy and Charlie have made about having that kind of long-term plan is absolutely essential. And I think that's quite hard for social housing organisations at the moment, because it requires a real transformation. So roofing programmes are going on and they're just happening. And what you need is for all of those roofing designs to be changed, where you've got properties that are going to have external wall insulation, so that they're all designed in advance, ready for the programmes that come afterwards. That's quite a big shift. That's kind of where we're aiming for with the Destination Zero project. But we need those kind of template designs and examples, and then you need a lot of training to be rolled out for those teams that are actually doing the roofs, so that they can insulate them properly, they can extend them sufficiently, and prepare the ground for the next energy measures that come along afterwards.
That's great, thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to keep it to one question, although it might have more than one part. But Emily, in your presentation, you emphasised the fact that actually to meet net zero goals, we'll need to retrofit eight homes per minute. And if we don't crack on, that's going to be even more homes per minute shortly. And I think we've seen in the press over the last few weeks, some people kind of using these stats to try and make the argument that actually it's not possible to get to net zero, and painting quite a negative story around that. So I wanted to ask you all, first of all, what do you think is needed in order to scale up retrofit to the scale we need to get to? And I appreciate that there won't be one silver bullet, but what do you think are some of the most important things? And then the second part to the question is, what would you say to people who sort of say it's not possible? Like, do you think it is possible, and if so, what makes you optimistic? I'm going to go to Emily first.
So I think our asks of government are 5 things I think are really important. So I think the zero VAT, at the moment there's a disincentive to retrofit instead of new build. That's crazy. When we know we need to retrofit, that should just be a policy that's aligned straight away. I think for us, it's similar to the offshore wind accelerator, which made a huge difference in that industry, needs to happen for retrofit. So rather than having a kind of view to grant being used forever and a day to fund this work, actually we need a programme where that grant is structured in such a way that it incentivises investment in the industry to create the solutions that are required to be able to achieve net zero. And that kind of long runway that enables the industry to understand that this is serious and that this is coming, and gets people behind it, and enables those kinds of training opportunities that Charlie's talked about, and those area-based schemes that Andy's delivering to really kind of have long enough to get off the ground properly and be implemented properly. But I think there is some movement. The Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund does look as though it's there for the long term, which is encouraging, although at the moment it's kind of gone back to single measures, which is disappointing. And I think there is a wider recognition more recently, and as again Charlie's pointed out, there's more appetite from people now to do this, so we can start to see a shift in people becoming much more interested in what they can do to help the climate issues, and people starting to recognise that they can start from home. So I think there is definitely reason for some optimism around that.
Brilliant, thanks. Charlie.
Yes, optimism. I am an eternal optimist, and because I have to be. I've brought 4 children into this world along with my partner. Obviously, she did the lion's share of the work, and so I've got a duty to offer them a future, not just an apology. But I despair. I've been at this for 15 years now, trying to make retrofit actually happen and make it work, and trying to build scale and increasing awareness of the urgency of the problem. And whilst we might be getting there, the task before us is somewhat daunting. Every borough in the country needs to be able to find about 2,500 new construction people to do the retrofit task before us. That is not to be sniffed at. There is absolutely no recognition of that at all. We're still tiptoeing. I don't understand why we're tiptoeing around the tulip. Somebody should just be standing there and going, "Oi!" I mean, realistically, we ought to be bringing back the technical colleges and stop them being tick box because someone's having to earn their money on the basis of the number of ticks they got, and actually having their money earned on the number of people that they got onto site doing proper work. And we need a root and branch overhaul of the construction industry to deliver this. Whether it's people in factories delivering Emily's energy Sprung, or whether it's people in the nice houses doing the craft-based work, or all of the above, realistically, we have a desperate problem there. The work we did for West Yorkshire the year before last now proved that we can make retrofit pay for itself to get to zero, but we just don't have the people to do it. The capacity crisis in construction should not be underestimated.
Thanks. Andy, I'm going to go to you for the last word. What would you add to what the others have said?
I broadly agree with the other speakers, and I think it's a really key point. But I suppose my comment would be perhaps a slightly higher level one. In retrofit and indeed construction generally, there are very few genuine technical and building physics barriers to getting effectively any property to a genuine net zero carbon measure. Yes. There is also in the construction and operation taken holistically over the length of the lifespan of a building, the money in the system is just in the wrong places in the system. So in that context, getting homes to net zero carbon is more deliverable than getting zero carbon aviation, which we haven't got the technology invented yet. It's more deliverable than getting zero carbon heavy industry, which we haven't got the technology yet. And it's more deliverable than getting zero carbon agriculture, because we've still not figured out how to stop cows farting. So ultimately, we don't have a choice about net zero carbon, and we are one of the easiest sectors, however hard it may feel, we are one of the easiest sectors to deliver this.
That's a good point.
That's a great place to finish. You're right, all properties can be retrofitted and can get to zero carbon, and we have the technology. So basically, as Charlie's saying, we know what to do, we just need to go out and do it. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining. Thanks, audience, for your great questions. A couple of people asked whether this event will be posted as a video. It will, so look out for the link. And please, if you can, take a minute to fill in our survey, just to leave your feedback. It really helps us improve future events. But on that, I'd just like to thank Andy, Emily and Charlie. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I hope everyone enjoyed the event, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.